Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments. Are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard. But here's what most people don't understand about the Gilded Age. While millionaires like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were building mansions with more rooms than entire city blocks, just a few miles away, families of 8 were crammed into single rooms smaller than your average closet. This wasn't just poverty. This was systematic human warehousing on a scale America had never seen before. Today, I'm going to take you inside the tenements of New York City during the height of immigration, and I'm going to show you something that will change how you think about the American dream forever. Because what happened in these buildings wasn't just about housing shortages or economic hardship. It was about hope being slowly strangled by greed, dreams being crushed under the weight of survival, and human dignity being traded for profit margins. But before we dive into the darkness, let me tell you why this story matters so much right now. Every single policy debate we have about immigration, about housing, about poverty in America today has its roots in what happened inside these tenement walls. The choices made by landlords, politicians, and ordinary citizens during this period didn't just affect the people living through it. They created the blueprint for urban inequality that we're still dealing with today. And I'm not just going to give you statistics and dates. I'm going to tell you the stories of real people, like Maria Benedetto, a 19-year-old Italian girl who arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and a letter from her brother promising her work in a factory. Or Jacob Kowalski, a Polish carpenter who thought America would give his children the education he never had, only to watch his 10-year-old son disappear into the sweatshops just to keep the family from starving. These weren't just immigrants. These were human beings with dreams, fears, talents, and hopes just like yours. And what happened to them in those overcrowded, disease-infested buildings reveals something profound about what America was becoming during its greatest economic boom. So let's start with Maria, because her story begins exactly where millions of others did. Standing on the deck of a steamship, staring at the Statue of Liberty, and believing with every fibre of her being that she was about to start the greatest chapter of her life. Maria Benedetto stepped off the ferry at Battery Park on a cold March morning in 1891 with exactly 14 cents in her pocket, and an address scrawled on a piece of paper that was already falling apart from being handled so many times. The address led her to a 5-story brick building on Mulberry Street that looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. The windows were grimy, the fire escapes were rusted, and the front stoop was covered with children who should have been in school, but were instead hawking newspapers and shining shoes. This was 97 Mulberry Street, and it was going to be Maria's home for the next 3 years. Not just her building, mind you. Her actual home was going to be the back corner of a room on the 4th floor that she would share with her brother Antonio, his wife Rosa, their 2 children, and another Italian family she'd never met before in her life. When Maria climbed those stairs for the first time, the stench was overwhelming. The building had exactly 2 bathrooms for all 5 floors, and they were located in the basement. Most residents used chamber pots that they emptied out the windows into the narrow air shaft that separated their building from the identical tenement next door. The air shaft was so narrow that if you stretched your arms out, you could touch both buildings at the same time. It was supposed to provide light and ventilation. Instead, it became a vertical cesspool that trapped disease and despair. Maria's corner of the room was separated from the rest by a thin blanket hung on a rope. It measured exactly 6 feet by 4 feet. In this space, she kept her few possessions, slept on a mattress made of straw, and tried to maintain some semblance of privacy and dignity. The room had one window that faced the air shaft, which meant it received about 30 minutes of actual sunlight per day. But here's what's truly heartbreaking about Maria's situation. She wasn't unusual. She wasn't even particularly unlucky. This was standard. This was what America offered to the people who came here seeking a better life. The building at 97 Mulberry Street was designed to house 20 families. Instead, it housed 43. Every room had been subdivided, every closet had been turned into a bedroom, and every inch of space had been monetized. The landlord, a man named Thomas Burns, who lived in a mansion on Fifth Avenue, collected rent from each family every week. He never visited the building. He never saw the conditions. He just sent his rent collector, a man everyone called Big Mike, who carried a club and had very little patience for sob stories about sick children or lost jobs. Maria found work within her first week in America, which made her one of the lucky ones. She got a job at a garment factory on the Lower East Side, working 14 hours a day, sewing buttons onto coats for 50 cents a day. The factory was located in another tenement building, and the working conditions were somehow even worse than her living conditions. The factory occupied the top 2 floors of the building, and it employed mostly young women and children. The machines were powered by a steam engine in the basement, and the leather belts that transferred power throughout the building created a constant, deafening noise. The air was thick with fabric dust and lint, and the windows were kept closed to prevent drafts from affecting the delicate work. Maria worked alongside girls as young as 12 and women as old as 60, all hunched over sewing machines for hours on end. There were no breaks except for 30 minutes at noon, when they were allowed to eat lunch at their machines. The bathroom was in the basement, and workers were discouraged from using it more than twice per day. But Maria was grateful for the work. She was grateful to be in America. She wrote letters to her parents back in Naples telling them about the opportunities, about the money she was saving, about the plans she was making. She didn't tell them about the rats in her room, or the way her hands cramped so badly at night that she couldn't hold a fork, or the fact that 3 people in her building had died of tuberculosis in the past month. This is where Maria's story intersects with Jacob Kowalski's story, because the American dream was being sold to millions of people at exactly the same time, and the infrastructure to support that dream simply didn't exist. Jacob arrived from Krakow 6 months after Maria, but his expectations were completely different. Jacob was a skilled carpenter who had heard that America was desperate for skilled tradesmen, that a man with his talents could earn enough money in 5 years to buy land and start his own business. He brought his wife Anna and their 3 children, and they had saved enough money for their own apartment. What Jacob discovered was that New York City in 1891 was experiencing the greatest construction boom in its history, but it wasn't being built by skilled craftsmen earning decent wages. It was being built by whoever would work for the lowest pay under the most dangerous conditions. The construction companies had figured out that they could hire recent immigrants at a fraction of the cost of established workers, and if someone got hurt or died on the job, there were 10 more men waiting to take their place. Jacob's first job was helping to build another tenement building, just like the one he was living in. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was literally constructing the very type of overcrowded, unsafe housing that was slowly crushing his family's dreams. The working conditions on construction sites were lethal. There were no safety regulations, no protective equipment, and no compensation for injuries. Workers balanced on narrow beams 5 stories above the street with no safety ropes. They mixed mortar by hand, using lime that burned their skin. They worked in all weather conditions, and if they missed a day due to illness or injury, they were usually replaced permanently. Jacob watched men fall to their deaths. He saw workers lose fingers to machinery, develop lung diseases from breathing construction dust, and suffer permanent injuries from accidents that could have been prevented with basic safety measures. But he also saw something else. He saw that the men who complained, who tried to organize for better conditions, who spoke up about unsafe practices, were quickly blacklisted from job sites throughout the city. So Jacob kept quiet and kept working, even as his own health began to deteriorate. The physical demands of construction work, combined with the poor nutrition and unsanitary living conditions in his tenement, were taking their toll. But it was what happened to his children that broke his spirit completely. Jacob's oldest son, Piotr, was 10 years old and had been attending public school for 6 months. Piotr was bright, eager to learn English, and excited about the possibilities that education might bring. But as winter approached and work became scarce, Jacob was forced to make a decision that haunts millions of immigrant families. He had to choose between keeping his son in school or sending him to work in a factory to help keep the family from starving. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Piotr went to work at a textile mill in Brooklyn, standing on a wooden box for 12 hours a day so he could reach the machinery he was operating. His job was to crawl under the massive looms, to tie broken threads and clear away cotton waste. It was dangerous work for an adult, and it was deadly work for a child. But Piotr's wages, 25 cents a day, meant the difference between the family eating or going hungry. It meant the difference between paying rent or being evicted onto the streets. It meant survival, even as it destroyed any hope Jacob had harbored about his children having better lives than he had. This is the reality that millions of immigrant families faced during the Gilded Age. Every day brought impossible choices between immediate survival and long-term dreams. Every decision was a trade-off between dignity and necessity, and the people profiting from this system, the landlords and factory owners and politicians, were getting richer than anyone in human history had ever been. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. The overcrowding, the disease, the exploitation, the child labor, none of it was necessary. It wasn't an inevitable result of immigration or economic growth. It was the result of deliberate choices made by people who had the power to create something better, but chose profit over humanity. The tenement system wasn't some accident of history or natural consequence of rapid growth. It was engineered by men who understood exactly what they were creating. Take James Ford, who owned 17 tenement buildings on the Lower East Side and made more money in a single month than most of his tenants would see in their entire lifetimes. Ford had studied the housing patterns in London's worst slums and deliberately copied them because he realized that desperation was the most profitable commodity in America. Ford's buildings were architectural nightmares designed to maximize profit per square foot. He hired architects who specialized in cramming the maximum number of people into the minimum amount of space while still technically complying with the city's pathetically weak housing codes. These weren't homes. They were human storage units with a monthly fee attached. The typical Ford tenement was 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep, built on lots that should have housed single families. Instead, they contained what were called railroad apartments, long, narrow units where rooms connected to each other in a straight line, like train cars. To get to the bedroom in the back, you had to walk through the kitchen, the living room, and often through other families' spaces. But the real genius of Ford's system was psychological. He understood that immigrants were so grateful to be in America, so terrified of being sent back to the poverty they'd fled, that they would endure almost anything without complaining. He knew that people like Maria and Jacob would convince themselves that their suffering was temporary, that it was just the price they had to pay for the American dream. And Ford was right. Maria Benedetto worked in that garment factory for 3 years, slowly destroying her hands and her lungs, telling herself that it was all worth it because she was saving money to bring her younger sister to America. She calculated that if she could just survive 5 more years of those conditions, she would have enough saved to open her own small shop, maybe find a husband, start the life she dreamed about during those long weeks crossing the Atlantic. What Maria didn't know was that the system was rigged against her from the beginning. The garment factory where she worked was owned by a man named Samuel Rothschild, who had contracts with department stores throughout the city. Rothschild paid his workers the absolute minimum he could get away with, but he charged the department stores premium prices for the coats and dresses his workers produced. The math was simple and brutal. Maria sewed buttons on 12 coats per day. Each coat sold for $8 in the department stores. Maria was paid 50 cents for her entire day's work. Even accounting for materials and overhead, Rothschild was making roughly $10 profit per day from Maria's labor alone. Multiply that by the 200 women working in his factory, and you begin to understand the scale of wealth extraction that was happening. But Rothschild had convinced himself that he was actually helping these immigrants. He told his wealthy friends at dinner parties that he was providing jobs for people who would otherwise be unemployed, that he was teaching them valuable skills, that he was contributing to their assimilation into American society. He genuinely believed that the 50 cents he paid Maria was generous, because after all, she was just a girl from Italy who couldn't even speak proper English. This self-deception was epidemic among the wealthy class during the Gilded Age. They had created a mythology that justified the suffering they were causing, a story that painted exploitation as opportunity and desperation as character building. They convinced themselves that the immigrants should be grateful, that hardship would make them stronger, that this was simply how capitalism was supposed to work. Meanwhile, back in the tenements, the human cost of this mythology was mounting daily. Maria's building on Mulberry Street became a petri dish for diseases that had been virtually eliminated in wealthier parts of the city. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and diphtheria spread through the overcrowded rooms like wildfire through dry grass. The building had no ventilation system, no proper sewage disposal, and no clean water supply. Residents drew their water from a single pump in the courtyard that was connected to the same system that carried away their waste. The connection between contaminated water and disease was well understood by 1891, but implementing proper sanitation systems in tenements would have cost money, and that would have reduced profits. So people died instead. They died of diseases that were completely preventable. They died because landlords like Thomas Burns calculated that it was cheaper to replace dead tenants than to install proper plumbing. They died because the city officials who were supposed to enforce health codes were being paid to look the other way. Maria watched her roommate's baby die of diarrhea that lasted for 6 days. The baby's name was Giuseppe, and he was 8 months old. His mother, Rosa, had been working at a different garment factory while trying to nurse the baby and care for her 3-year-old daughter. When Giuseppe got sick, Rosa couldn't afford to miss work to care for him, and she couldn't afford to take him to a doctor. So Giuseppe died in that corner of the room where Maria slept, his tiny body racked with dehydration while his mother sewed collars on shirts 12 blocks away. Rosa came home that evening to find her son's body cold and stiff, and the sound she made when she realized what had happened was unlike anything Maria had ever heard. It was the sound of hope dying, of dreams being murdered by a system that treated human life as an acceptable loss in the pursuit of profit. The death certificates from tenement districts during this period tell a story that most history books gloss over. Infant mortality rates in buildings like 97 Mulberry Street were higher than in the worst slums of medieval Europe. Children were dying of malnutrition in the richest city, in the richest country in the world. The life expectancy for tenement dwellers was 23 years shorter than for people living just 20 blocks uptown. But even death was monetized in the tenement system. Undertakers who specialized in serving immigrant communities charged families enormous fees for basic funeral services, knowing that cultural and religious traditions made it impossible for grieving families to simply dispose of bodies without proper ceremonies. Families went into debt to bury their children, adding financial devastation to their grief. Jacob Kowalski experienced this firsthand when his youngest daughter, little Anna, died of scarlet fever at age 4. The undertaker demanded $12 for a funeral, which was more than Jacob earned in 3 weeks of construction work. But Polish tradition demanded that Anna be buried properly, with prayers and ceremony. So Jacob borrowed the money from a loan shark, who charged interest rates that would have been illegal if anyone had bothered to enforce the laws. The loan shark was a man named Mickey Torino, who operated out of a saloon on Hester Street and had financial relationships with half the families in the neighborhood. Torino understood that desperate people make poor financial decisions, and he had built his entire business model around exploiting grief, emergency, and hope. When immigrants needed money for medical bills, Torino was there with cash and a contract written in English that most borrowers couldn't read. When families needed money for rent to avoid eviction, Torino provided loans with interest rates of 30% per month. When someone died and families needed money for funerals, Torino positioned himself as a compassionate community leader who was just trying to help his neighbors during their darkest hours. The reality was that Torino was systematically trapping families in cycles of debt that could last for generations. Jacob's loan for his daughter's funeral turned into a financial nightmare that consumed his family's income for the next 2 years. Every month, Jacob paid Torino $3 just in interest, while the principal amount of the loan never seemed to decrease. This debt peonage system was another layer of the exploitation machine that the tenement economy had created. Families who were already spending everything they earned just to survive were forced deeper into poverty by predatory lending practices that were specifically designed to target the most vulnerable people in the city. And the truly diabolical aspect of this system was that it was all perfectly legal. The laws that might have protected immigrant families were either non-existent or unenforced. The politicians who could have regulated lending practices were receiving campaign contributions from the same men who owned the tenements and the factories. The judges, who might have provided legal remedies, lived in neighborhoods where they never had to witness the suffering their decisions caused. This wasn't just individual greed or personal moral failing. This was systematic, institutional extraction of wealth from the poorest people in society, organized and executed by some of the most powerful men in America. And it was all happening while those same men gave speeches about American values, Christian charity, and the nobility of hard work. The psychological impact of this betrayal was devastating for people like Maria and Jacob, who had risked everything to come to America based on promises of opportunity and fairness. They had believed in the mythology of America as a land where hard work was rewarded, where anyone could improve their circumstances through determination and virtue. Instead, they discovered that America was a place where hard work was exploited, where determination was taken advantage of, and where virtue was seen as weakness by the people with power. The cognitive dissonance of this realization broke many immigrants spiritually, even as the physical conditions of tenement life broke their bodies. Maria began to understand this during her second winter in America, when she watched her brother Antonio slowly give up hope. Antonio had been in New York for 5 years by the time Maria arrived, and he had initially been one of those immigrants who genuinely believed that persistence and effort would eventually pay off. But 5 years of tenement life had worn Antonio down to nothing. He had watched friends die of preventable diseases, seen children disappear into dangerous factories, witnessed families destroyed by debt and desperation. He had worked construction jobs that permanently damaged his back, factory jobs that filled his lungs with toxic dust, and delivery jobs that kept him on the street for 16 hours a day. And for all of that suffering, for all of that sacrifice, Antonio was exactly where he had started 5 years earlier, still living in the same overcrowded room, still unable to afford decent food or medical care, still sending every spare penny to relatives back in Italy, while his own family slowly starved in America. The promise of upward mobility, of gradual improvement, of eventual success, had revealed itself to be a cruel fiction designed to keep people working under conditions that no human being should have to endure. Antonio had kept believing in that promise long past the point when all evidence suggested it was a lie, because the alternative, accepting that he had traded everything for nothing, was too painful to contemplate. But by Maria's second winter, Antonio had stopped talking about the future. He had stopped making plans, stopped dreaming, stopped believing that tomorrow might be better than today. He went to work, came home, ate whatever meager food they could afford, and stared at the wall until it was time to sleep. The light had gone out of his eyes, and Maria could see that her strong, optimistic brother was dying inside, even as his body continued to function. This spiritual death was as much a part of the tenement experience as the physical disease and economic exploitation. The system didn't just steal people's money and destroy their health. It murdered their hope, crushed their dreams, and convinced them that their suffering was somehow their own fault. This psychological warfare was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire system, because it convinced its victims that they were complicit in their own destruction. Maria began to internalize the shame that the system wanted her to feel. She started believing that maybe she wasn't working hard enough, maybe she wasn't grateful enough, maybe she didn't deserve better than what she had. But the truth was far more sinister. The tenement system had been deliberately engineered to create this exact response. Men like Thomas Burns and Samuel Rothschild understood that broken people don't organize, don't demand better conditions, don't threaten the profits that were flowing upward to the wealthy neighborhoods where the real Americans lived. And while Maria was learning to hate herself, while Jacob was watching his dreams die one day at a time, something else was happening in those overcrowded rooms that would reshape American society forever. The children who were growing up in these conditions weren't just surviving. They were adapting in ways that would horrify their parents and fascinate social scientists for decades to come. Take Tommy Sullivan, an Irish boy who lived 2 floors below Maria in the same building on Mulberry Street. Tommy was 12 years old, but he had the streetwise cunning of someone 3 times his age. His father had died in a construction accident when Tommy was 8, and his mother worked 16 hours a day in a commercial laundry, coming home with hands so raw from lye soap that she couldn't hold a spoon without wincing. Tommy had been going to school sporadically until he was 10, but the reality of his family's financial situation made education a luxury they couldn't afford. Instead, Tommy became part of New York's vast underground economy of child entrepreneurs, street hustlers, and junior criminals who had learned to extract money from the city in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Tommy's daily routine started before sunrise. He would leave the tenement and walk to the newspaper distribution center on Park Row, where he would buy 50 copies of the morning paper for 2 cents each. Then he would spend the next 6 hours walking through the business district, selling papers to office workers and merchants for 3 cents each. If he sold all 50 papers, he made 50 cents profit, which was exactly what Maria made working 14 hours in the garment factory. But Tommy was just getting started. After the morning papers were sold, he would transition to his afternoon hustle, which involved running messages between businesses that couldn't afford their own delivery systems. Tommy knew every shortcut, every alley, every building entrance in lower Manhattan. He could get a message from the financial district to the docks in half the time it would take an adult, and he charged accordingly. By evening, Tommy would shift into his most lucrative activity, which was guiding tourists and well-dressed visitors through the maze of tenement streets. Wealthy New Yorkers had developed a morbid fascination with how the other half lived, and they would pay boys like Tommy to take them on guided tours of the slums. Tommy had perfected a routine that highlighted the most dramatic aspects of tenement life, while carefully avoiding the areas where real danger lurked. He would take these tourists past buildings where families were being evicted, show them the overcrowded markets where spoiled food was sold at premium prices, and explain the complex social hierarchies that determined which families got the slightly better rooms and which families ended up in the basement next to the communal toilets. The tourists found these expeditions thrilling in the same way that people today might find a horror movie entertaining. They could experience the shock and revulsion of witnessing extreme poverty, while knowing that they would be returning to their comfortable homes at the end of the evening. For Tommy, these tours represented his highest earning potential, sometimes bringing in as much as $2 for a single afternoon's work. But what Tommy was really selling wasn't just information about tenement life. He was selling a performance of poverty that confirmed everything his wealthy customers already believed about the moral and intellectual superiority of their own class. Tommy had learned to present himself and his community in ways that made the tourists feel simultaneously horrified and reassured, sympathetic and superior. This performance required Tommy to develop skills that no 12-year-old should have needed. He learned to read people instantly, to understand what they wanted to see and hear, to manipulate their emotions and expectations for profit. He became fluent in the psychology of exploitation, understanding how to turn his own family's suffering into entertainment for people who had never missed a meal in their lives. The tragedy was that Tommy was brilliant. He had a natural intelligence and entrepreneurial spirit that, under different circumstances, might have made him a successful businessman or professional. Instead, the tenement system was channeling that intelligence into survival strategies that would ultimately trap him in the same cycles of poverty and desperation that had destroyed his father. Tommy's story intersected with Maria's in ways that neither of them fully understood at the time. The garment factory where Maria worked was part of a supply chain that ultimately served the same wealthy customers who paid Tommy for slum tours. The coats that Maria sewed buttons on were sold in department stores that catered to the exact same social class that found entertainment in witnessing her living conditions. This wasn't coincidence. It was the logical structure of an economic system that had learned to profit from every aspect of human misery while maintaining the fiction that such misery was either necessary or deserved. The wealthy customers who bought Maria's work and Tommy's tours went home feeling satisfied that they were contributing to the American economy, while also gaining first-hand knowledge of social conditions that they could discuss at dinner parties. Meanwhile, in another part of the same tenement building, a different kind of adaptation was taking place. Katarina Nowak, a 15-year-old Polish girl, had discovered that the traditional moral frameworks that her parents had brought from the old country were completely inadequate for surviving in the new world they had entered. Katarina's parents had raised her to believe that virtue, hard work, and religious faith would be rewarded with security and respectability. They had taught her that a good girl waited for marriage, obeyed her parents, and trusted that God would provide for those who lived righteously. But 2 years in the tenements had taught Katarina that virtue was a luxury that only wealthy people could afford, and that God seemed to have very little interest in the daily struggles of people like her family. Katarina had watched her mother work herself to the point of collapse, while remaining faithful to all the moral teachings that were supposed to guarantee divine protection. She had seen her father sacrifice his health and dignity for wages that barely kept the family from starvation, all while maintaining his belief that honest labor would eventually lead to prosperity. She had witnessed families who followed every religious rule and moral principle still lose their children to disease, still get evicted for unpaid rent, still sink deeper into debt and desperation despite their virtue. At the same time, Katarina observed that the people who seemed to thrive in the tenement environment were those who had abandoned traditional moral constraints entirely. The loan sharks who charged desperate families impossible interest rates lived better than anyone else in the neighborhood. The landlords who packed human beings into unsafe, unsanitary buildings were getting rich from their cruelty. The factory owners who worked children 12 hours a day in dangerous conditions were celebrated as successful businessmen. So Katarina began experimenting with different approaches to survival. She started by lying to potential employers about her age and experience, discovering that deception could open doors that honesty kept locked. She learned to flirt with male supervisors in ways that might earn her slightly better treatment or easier work assignments. She began stealing small items from the department stores where she worked, reasoning that her wages were so inadequate that theft was simply another form of compensation. Each of these moral compromises felt terrible at first, but they also produced results in ways that virtue never had. Katerina's lies got her better jobs. Her manipulation of male authority figures protected her from some of the worst abuses that other girls endured. Her theft provided her family with necessities that they couldn't afford on legitimate wages. More importantly, these compromises gave Katerina a sense of agency and control that she had never experienced while trying to follow her parents' moral teachings. Instead of being a passive victim of circumstances beyond her control, she became an active participant in shaping her own survival. Instead of waiting for God or society to rescue her, she learned to rescue herself through whatever means necessary. But this transformation came at a psychological cost that Katerina wouldn't fully understand until years later. Each moral compromise made the next one easier. Each successful deception made honesty seem more naive. Each act of manipulation made genuine human connection more difficult. Katerina was learning to survive in the tenement system, but she was also learning to become the kind of person that the tenement system rewarded. This process was happening to thousands of young people throughout the tenement districts, creating a generation that had been forced to develop survival skills that would have shocked their grandparents. Children who should have been learning arithmetic and history were instead mastering the psychology of exploitation. Teenagers who should have been developing their talents and interests were instead learning to weaponize their sexuality, their ethnicity, their family's suffering. The tenement system wasn't just housing people inadequately. It was systematically corrupting the moral and social development of an entire generation, creating patterns of behavior and belief that would ripple through American society for decades to come. The children who survived these conditions would carry the trauma and the coping mechanisms they had developed into their own families, their communities, their political participation, and the wealthy Americans who had created and profited from this system remained completely insulated from its long-term consequences. They lived in neighborhoods where they never encountered the people whose lives they had destroyed. They sent their children to schools where the curriculum never mentioned tenement conditions. They attended churches where the sermons focused on individual virtue rather than systemic injustice. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was carefully maintained through residential patterns, social customs, and information systems that ensured the wealthy could continue believing in their own moral superiority while remaining ignorant of the human cost of their privilege. They convinced themselves that the immigrants in the tenements were poor because they lacked character, diseased because they lacked hygiene, desperate because they lacked initiative. But the truth was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, even for those who had the most invested in maintaining the fiction. By 1892, the tenement districts were producing social problems that couldn't be contained within their boundaries. Crime rates were soaring as people like Tommy Sullivan and Katerina Nowak developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for extracting resources from the broader economy. Disease outbreaks in the tenements were spreading to wealthier neighborhoods despite all efforts to contain them. Political corruption was becoming so blatant that even friendly newspapers were beginning to investigate and report on the connections between tenement landlords and city officials. Most troubling of all, the children who were growing up in these conditions were beginning to come of age, and they were not turning into the grateful, hard-working Americans that the mythology had promised. Instead, they were becoming something entirely new in American society, a generation that had learned to view the official values and institutions of their country with cynicism and contempt. These young people had watched their parents' faith in American promises get rewarded with exploitation and suffering. They had seen virtue punished and vice rewarded so consistently that they had developed their own alternative moral systems based on survival rather than traditional ethics. They understood the real power structures of American society in ways that made them dangerous to the people who had created those structures. Maria Benedetto was beginning to recognize this transformation in herself by her third year in America. The naive young woman who had stepped off the boat believing in hard work and delayed gratification, had been replaced by someone harder, more calculating, more willing to do whatever was necessary to protect herself and the people she cared about. When Maria's younger sister finally arrived from Italy in 1894, Maria hardly recognized the person she had become. Her sister looked at her with the same hopeful, trusting eyes that Maria had once possessed, and Maria realized that she could no longer remember what it felt like to believe in the promises that had brought her to America. Instead of warning her sister about what lay ahead, instead of preparing her for the reality of tenement life, Maria found herself participating in the same deception that had trapped her. She told her sister about the opportunities, about the money that could be earned, about the better life that was waiting just around the corner. She repeated the same lies that had been told to her, because the alternative, telling the truth, would have destroyed her sister's spirit before she had even begun to fight. This complicity in her own sister's deception marked the final stage of Maria's transformation, from victim to participant in the system that had nearly destroyed her. She had learned not just to survive the tenement economy, but to help it reproduce itself by recruiting new victims and maintaining the mythologies that kept people trapped within it. The tenement system had achieved something unprecedented in human history. It had created a form. Victims became willing participants in perpetuating their own op of exploitation so complete, so psychologically devastating, that it's rationed. People like Maria and Jacob and Tommy and Katerina weren't just surviving in spite of the system. They were learning to thrive within it by becoming the kinds of people the system required them to become. And all of this was happening while the men who had designed and profited from this system were being celebrated as the greatest success stories in American history, philanthropists and visionaries whose names would be carved into the buildings of universities and hospitals, whose legacies would be remembered as monuments to American achievement and generosity. The disconnect between the mythology and the reality had become so complete that the same society could simultaneously celebrate the Gilded Age as America's greatest economic triumph, while systematically destroying the lives of millions of people whose labor had made that triumph possible. But something else was beginning to happen in those tenement buildings, something that the architects of the system had not anticipated and could not control. The very conditions that were designed to break people's spirits and isolate them from each other were also creating new forms of solidarity, resistance, and collective action that would eventually challenge the entire structure of American capitalism. In the cramped corners and narrow hallways of buildings like 97 Mulberry Street, something unexpected was taking root. While landlords like Thomas Burns counted their profits, and factory owners like Samuel Rothschild calculated their margins, the people they were exploiting were beginning to discover that their individual suffering was part of a much larger pattern. It started with conversations. Late at night, when the noise from the street finally died down and the children had fallen asleep despite their hunger, women like Maria would find themselves talking with their neighbors in ways they never had before. The thin walls that separated their rooms meant that privacy was impossible, but it also meant that secrets were impossible. Rosa Benedetto, who had lost her baby Giuseppe to preventable disease, began talking with Katerina Nowak about the conditions in their respective workplaces. What they discovered was that the same patterns of exploitation were being repeated across every industry, every neighborhood, every ethnic community. The garment factories, the construction sites, the commercial laundries, the street vendor operations, they all operated according to the same basic principle: extract maximum value from human labor while providing minimum compensation and protection. These conversations were dangerous because they threatened the isolation that kept the system functioning. As long as each family believed their suffering was unique, as long as each worker thought their exploitation was personal, the system could continue operating without organized resistance. But when people began comparing their experiences, when they started recognizing the systematic nature of their oppression, they also began imagining collective responses. The first organized action in Maria's building was almost accidental. A new family, the Kowalskis, had moved into the basement room next to the communal toilets. The landlord, Thomas Burns, had raised their rent by 50% after their first month, claiming that improvements had been made to the building. The improvements consisted of a single coat of paint in the hallway and a new lock on the front door. Jacob Kowalski couldn't afford the rent increase, but he also couldn't afford to move his family again. Moving meant losing deposits, paying new fees, and risking homelessness while searching for alternative housing that might not exist. So Jacob came to his neighbours with a simple proposition. What if they all refused to pay the rent increase together? The idea was terrifying to people like Maria, who had spent 3 years learning that resistance led to retaliation, that complaints led to eviction, that any form of organised action would be met with swift and brutal consequences. But the idea was also intoxicating, because it offered something that individual compliance had never provided: the possibility of actually changing their circumstances rather than simply enduring them. The rent strike that began in Maria's building in the winter of 1894 started with just 8 families, but it spread through the tenement district like the diseases that regularly swept through their overcrowded rooms. Within 6 weeks, over 200 families across 12 buildings were withholding their rent payments and demanding basic improvements to their living conditions. The landlord's response was immediate and vicious. Eviction notices were served, locks were changed, and families found themselves on the street with their possessions in the snow. But something had shifted in the psychology of the tenement communities. Instead of accepting these evictions as inevitable consequences of challenging authority, neighbours began taking in the evicted families, sharing their already inadequate space and resources to keep the resistance alive. Maria found herself housing the Kowalski family in her corner of the room after they were evicted from the basement. 5 additional people in a space that had barely accommodated her, but the cramped conditions felt different when they were the result of solidarity rather than exploitation. The physical discomfort was the same, but the psychological experience was completely transformed. For the first time since arriving in America, Maria felt like she was part of something larger than her individual struggle for survival. She was participating in a collective effort to change the conditions that had been slowly killing her community. The fear and desperation that had defined her daily experience for 3 years were still present, but they were now accompanied by something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. The rent strike lasted for 4 months, and it ultimately failed in its immediate objectives. The landlords had more resources, more political connections, and more legal options than the tenants. Families were evicted, blacklisted from other buildings, and forced to accept even worse housing conditions than they had been fighting against. By summer, most of the striking families had either moved away or returned to their original apartments under terms that were even more exploitative than before. But the strike had accomplished something that its organisers hadn't anticipated and its opponents couldn't reverse. It had created a network of relationships and a body of knowledge that would persist long after the immediate action had ended. People like Maria and Jacob had learned that organised resistance was possible, that their individual suffering was part of a systematic problem, and that collective action could challenge even the most entrenched forms of power. More importantly, they had discovered that the system they were fighting against was far more fragile than it appeared. The landlord's panicked response to the rent strike revealed that their profits depended entirely on their tenants' compliance and isolation. When that compliance was withdrawn, when that isolation was broken, the entire structure of exploitation became vulnerable in ways that individual acts of defiance never could have achieved. This knowledge began spreading through informal networks that connected tenement buildings across the city. Workers in different industries started comparing notes about their conditions and their employers. Women who had never spoken to each other began sharing information about which factories were the most dangerous, which landlords were the most ruthless, which loan sharks charged the highest interest rates. Katerina Nowak, became one of the key figures in this emerging network, using the street smarts and social skills she had developed for individual survival to help coordinate collective action. The same ability to read people and manipulate situations that had helped her navigate the predatory environment of the tenements now became tools for organizing resistance against that environment. Katerina began hosting informal meetings in the basement of her building, where women from different ethnic communities would gather to share information and plan coordinated responses to common problems. These meetings were conducted in a mixture of languages, with participants translating for each other and developing a shared vocabulary of resistance that transcended the ethnic divisions that landlords and employers had used to keep workers isolated from each other. The basement meetings became a kind of alternative education system, where women who had been denied formal schooling taught each other practical skills for surviving and fighting back against exploitation. They shared techniques for avoiding the most dangerous machinery in the factories, strategies for dealing with abusive supervisors, methods for organizing informal childcare cooperatives that allowed more women to work outside their homes. But they also shared something more fundamental, a different understanding of what America was and what it could become. The mythology that had brought them to the country promised individual success through individual effort. The reality they had discovered was that individual effort under these conditions led only to individual destruction. But collective effort, they were learning, could challenge the conditions themselves. Tommy Sullivan, the 12-year-old entrepreneur who had been running guided tours of the slums for wealthy tourists, became involved in this network through his mother's participation in the basement meetings. Tommy's street knowledge and his familiarity with the broader geography of Lower Manhattan made him valuable as a messenger and coordinator between different tenement communities. But Tommy's involvement in the organizing network also forced him to confront the moral compromises he had been making in his individual survival strategies. The wealthy tourists who paid him for slum tours were the same people who owned the tenements and factories that were destroying his community. His entertainment performances were helping to justify and normalize the very conditions that the organizing network was trying to change. This recognition created an internal crisis for Tommy that reflected a broader tension within the tenement communities. The survival strategies that individuals had developed to navigate the system often conflicted with the collective strategies that were needed to change the system. People who had learned to profit from their own oppression had to decide whether they were willing to sacrifice those profits for the possibility of ending the oppression entirely. Tommy's decision came during a particularly elaborate slum tour he was conducting for a group of wealthy women who were visiting from Boston. The tour included stops at several tenement buildings, a garment factory, and a commercial laundry where the tourists could observe the working conditions while maintaining a safe distance from any actual danger or discomfort. As Tommy was explaining the cramped living conditions in one of the buildings, pointing out the inadequate ventilation and the overcrowded rooms, one of the tourists made a comment that stopped him cold. She remarked to her companions that the immigrants seemed to prefer living in these conditions, that they probably wouldn't know what to do with better housing, even if it were provided to them. The comment was delivered in a tone of casual, anthropological observation, as if Tommy and his community were exotic specimens whose behavior could be analyzed and explained without any consideration of their humanity or agency. The tourist wasn't being deliberately cruel. She was simply expressing the worldview that justified her comfortable lifestyle and her community's indifference to tenement conditions. But for Tommy, hearing his family's suffering described as a cultural preference rather than a consequence of systematic exploitation was a moment of clarity that changed everything. He realized that his slum tours weren't just entertaining these wealthy visitors. They were providing them with intellectual frameworks that allowed them to maintain their privilege without experiencing guilt or moral conflict. Tommy finished the tour that day, collected his payment, and then walked directly to Katerina's basement meeting that evening. He told the assembled women about the conversation he had overheard, about the way their suffering was being interpreted and justified by the people who profited from it. about his own role in maintaining those interpretations. The women listened to Tommy's account with a mixture of anger and recognition. They had all experienced similar moments when they realized how their oppression was being rationalized by the people who benefited from it. But Tommy's insider knowledge of how wealthy New Yorkers actually thought and talked about tenement communities provided them with strategic information they had never had access to before. More importantly, Tommy's decision to abandon his lucrative tour business in favor of supporting the organizing network represented a new kind of choice that was becoming available to people in the tenement communities. Instead of individual advancement through participation in their own exploitation, they could choose collective resistance through solidarity with others who shared their conditions. This choice was being made by increasing numbers of people across the tenement districts, and it was beginning to create a social movement that would eventually challenge not just the specific abuses of the housing and labor systems, but the entire structure of American capitalism that made those abuses profitable and sustainable. Maria Benedetto found herself at the center of this movement almost by accident. Her corner room in the building on Mulberry Street had become an informal meeting place for women from the garment factories, and her ability to speak both Italian and broken English made her a natural translator and communicator between different ethnic communities. But Maria's role in the movement also forced her to confront the ways that her own survival strategies had been shaped by the system she was now fighting against. Her decision to deceive her younger sister about the reality of American conditions, her willingness to participate in the mythology that kept new immigrants trapped in exploitative situations, her complicity in maintaining the very illusions that had nearly destroyed her own life. The organizing network didn't demand that Maria reject or apologize for the choices she had made to survive, but it did require her to understand how those individual choices connected to the broader patterns of oppression and resistance that were shaping their community's future. It asked her to consider whether the strategies that had enabled her personal survival were compatible with the collective liberation they were all working toward. This question was being asked of everyone in the movement, and it was creating a new kind of moral framework that was neither the traditional ethics that people had brought from their home countries, nor the predatory individualism that the American system had tried to impose on them. Instead, it was an ethics of collective responsibility and mutual aid that recognized both the necessity of individual survival and the possibility of systemic change. The garment factory, where Maria worked, became a testing ground for these new ethical frameworks when the women workers began organizing for shorter hours and safer working conditions. The factory owner, Samuel Rothschild, responded to their organizing efforts by threatening to close the factory entirely and move his operations to a different city where labor was less organized and more desperate. This threat was designed to divide the workers against each other, to force them to choose between their immediate economic survival and their longer-term goals of improving their working conditions. It was the same divide and conquer strategy that had kept tenement communities isolated and powerless for decades. But the organizing network had prepared the garment workers for exactly this kind of threat. Instead of competing with each other for the remaining jobs, they organized collectively to call Rothschild's bluff. They pointed out that moving his entire operation would be expensive and time-consuming, that finding equally skilled workers in other cities would be difficult, and that the same organizing networks that existed in New York were beginning to develop in other industrial cities as well. More importantly, they demonstrated that they had alternatives to dependence on Rothschild's factory. The network had been developing cooperative economic relationships that could provide income and support for workers, even if individual employers decided to retaliate against organizing efforts. Women had been pooling their resources to start their own small businesses, sharing childcare responsibilities to allow more women to work, and creating informal insurance systems that could support families during strikes or lockouts. These cooperative economic structures represented something entirely new in American society. an alternative to both the traditional family-based economies that immigrants had brought from their home countries and the predatory individual capitalism that had dominated American industrial development. They were collective responses to collective problems, democratic institutions created by and for people who had been excluded from existing democratic institutions. The success of the garment workers' organizing effort sent shockwaves through the entire tenement district. Other groups of workers began organizing similar actions in their own industries, using the same combination of direct confrontation with employers and cooperative economic development within their own communities. Construction workers like Jacob Kowalski began refusing to work on projects that didn't meet basic safety standards, pooling their resources to support families of workers who were blacklisted for demanding safer conditions. Street vendors organized to resist police harassment and to negotiate collectively with suppliers for better prices on their merchandise. Even children like Tommy Sullivan began organizing newsboy strikes that demanded better terms from the newspaper publishers who had been exploiting their labor. Each of these individual struggles was small in comparison to the vast economic forces that dominated American society during the Gilded Age. But collectively, they represented something that the architects of the tenement system had never imagined possible: the emergence of organized resistance from the very people whose desperation and isolation had been the foundation of their profits. The response from the wealthy and powerful was swift and brutal. Police raids on tenement buildings became routine, with organizers arrested on fabricated charges and held without bail. Factory owners began hiring private security forces to intimidate workers who showed signs of organizing. Landlords started evicting entire families if any member was suspected of participating in resistance activities. But the movement had grown beyond the point where individual acts of repression could stop it. Every arrest created new organizers. Every eviction created new solidarity. Every act of violence by authorities created new awareness of the systematic nature of the oppression they were fighting against. Maria Benedetto was arrested during a raid on her building in the spring of 1896, charged with conspiracy to incite riot, and held in the city jail for 3 weeks without trial. The conditions in the jail were somehow even worse than the conditions in the tenements, with dozens of women packed into cells designed for a few, no sanitation facilities, and food that was inedible even by tenement standards. But the jail also became an organizing space where women from different communities and different struggles were brought together under the same roof for the first time. Maria found herself in conversations with Irish laundry workers, German brewery employees, Jewish seamstresses, and Italian street vendors, all of whom had been arrested for various forms of resistance to their working and living conditions. These conversations revealed that the organizing networks that had been developing in different ethnic communities were part of a much larger movement that was challenging the entire structure of American industrial capitalism. The problems they were fighting weren't specific to particular industries or particular immigrant groups. They were consequences of an economic system that treated human beings as disposable resources to be consumed in the pursuit of profit. When Maria was finally released from jail, she returned to a tenement district that had been transformed by 3 weeks of organizing in response to the mass arrests. The basement meetings that had started in individual buildings had evolved into neighborhood assemblies that brought together hundreds of people to coordinate resistance activities and mutual aid efforts. The garment factory where Maria had worked for 4 years had been shut down by a strike that began the day after her arrest and had spread to include workers from 6 other factories in the same neighborhood. The strike wasn't just about wages and working conditions. It was about the right of workers to organize without facing arrest and imprisonment. More importantly, the strike was being supported by the same cooperative economic networks that had been developing for months. Striking workers were receiving food and financial support from street vendors, construction workers, and domestic workers who understood that an injury to one was an injury to all. This solidarity across different industries and different ethnic communities represented something unprecedented in American labor history. Previous strikes and organizing efforts had typically been limited to individual workplaces or individual ethnic communities, making them vulnerable to the divide and conquer strategies that employers had perfected over decades of labor conflict. But the tenement organizing networks had created a different model of resistance, one that recognized the interconnected nature of all the different forms of exploitation that working people faced. Housing conditions, working conditions, lending practices, police harassment, political exclusion, they were all aspects of the same system, and they all had to be challenged together. The strike that began in Maria's factory ultimately lasted for 8 months and spread to include over 10,000 workers across Lower Manhattan. It became known as the Great Tenement Strike of 1896, and it marked the beginning of a new phase in American labor organizing that would eventually lead to fundamental changes in the relationship between workers and employers. But the strike also revealed the limits of what organized resistance could accomplish within the existing political and economic system. Despite their numbers, despite their solidarity, despite their willingness to sacrifice everything for the possibility of change, the striking workers were ultimately defeated by the combined power of employers, police, courts, and politicians who were all committed to maintaining the status quo. The factories reopened with new workers brought in from other cities. The tenement buildings were filled with new tenants desperate enough to accept any conditions, and the organizers who had led the resistance were blacklisted from employment throughout the region. Many of them, including Maria and Jacob, were forced to leave New York entirely, carrying their organizing experience and their understanding of systematic oppression to other industrial cities where the same struggles were beginning to develop. But something had changed permanently in the consciousness of working people throughout the country. The Great Tenement Strike had demonstrated that organized resistance was possible, that solidarity across ethnic and industrial lines could be created, and that the system of exploitation that seemed so permanent and inevitable was actually vulnerable to collective action. The children who had grown up during the strike, who had watched their parents choose collective resistance over individual survival, would carry these lessons into the 20th century. They would become the leaders of labor unions, socialist parties, and progressive political movements that would eventually force American capitalism to accommodate at least some of the demands that had been raised in the tenement districts of the 1890s. Tommy Sullivan, who had abandoned his slum tour business to support the organizing network, eventually became a labor organizer who spent his career building connections between different immigrant communities and different industries. His understanding of how wealthy Americans thought about working people, gained through his years of conducting tours for them, made him particularly effective at developing strategies that could counter the ideological justifications for exploitation. Katerina Nowak used her organizing experience in the tenement districts to become one of the first women labor organizers in the garment industry, traveling throughout the Northeast to help workers in different cities learn from the successes and failures of the New York organizing efforts. Her ability to build trust across ethnic and linguistic barriers, developed through years of basement meetings, became a model for inclusive organizing that challenged the exclusionary practices of many existing labor unions. Even Maria's sister, who had arrived in America just as the organizing networks were reaching their peak, was shaped by a completely different understanding of what was possible in America than Maria had possessed when she first arrived. Instead of accepting exploitation as the price of opportunity, Maria's sister understood from the beginning that resistance and solidarity were not just possible, but necessary for survival. The tenement system that had been designed to break people's spirits and isolate them from each other had ultimately created the conditions for forms of collective action that challenged the entire structure of American capitalism. The very people who had been written off as disposable resources had demonstrated that they possessed forms of knowledge, creativity, and moral courage that the wealthy and powerful could never understand or control. But the victory was incomplete, and the costs were enormous. Thousands of people had sacrificed their health, their families, their individual prospects for advancement, and in many cases their lives, for organizing efforts that achieved only partial and temporary improvements in their conditions. The system adapted to their resistance, finding new ways to extract profit from human suffering and new methods for preventing organized challenges to its authority. The children and grandchildren of the tenement organizers would face different but related forms of systematic oppression throughout the 20th century. They would fight new battles against housing discrimination, workplace exploitation, political exclusion, and economic inequality, using lessons learned in the overcrowded rooms and narrow hallways of buildings like 97 Mulberry Street. And in the 21st century, as new waves of immigrants arrive in America, seeking the same dreams that brought Maria Benedetto to New York in 1891, they encounter many of the same structural barriers and systematic forms of exploitation that defined the tenement experience. The specific conditions have changed, but the basic logic of the system remains the same. Extract maximum value from human labor and human desperation, while maintaining the mythology that such extraction represents opportunity rather than oppression. The lessons of the tenement organizing networks remain relevant because the problems they were fighting against remain unresolved. The choice between individual survival and collective resistance, between accommodation to exploitation and organized challenge to systematic oppression, between accepting the mythology of individual opportunity and understanding the reality of structural inequality, these choices continue to confront working people throughout America and throughout the world. The tenement tears that fell in the overcrowded rooms of the Gilded Age were not just expressions of individual suffering. They were also expressions of collective grief for dreams deferred, opportunities denied, and human potential wasted by systems that treated people as disposable resources rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. But those same tenements also produced forms of solidarity, resistance, and collective action that demonstrated the possibility of different relationships between people and different ways of organizing economic and social life. The basement meetings, the rent strikes, the factory organizing, the cooperative economic networks, they all pointed toward alternatives to the predatory individualism that dominated American society during its greatest economic boom. The immigrants who lived and died in those tenement buildings left behind more than just stories of suffering and exploitation. They left behind examples of courage, solidarity, and collective action that continue to inspire people who are fighting similar battles against similar systems of oppression. Their tears were not shed in vain if we learn from their struggles and continue their work of building a society based on human dignity rather than human exploitation. The gilded surface of America's greatest economic triumph was built on foundations of systematic cruelty that destroyed millions of lives in the pursuit of unprecedented wealth for a small number of people. But underneath that surface, in the overcrowded rooms and narrow hallways of the tenement buildings, people were creating something different. Communities of mutual aid, networks of resistance, and visions of what America could become if it lived up to its own stated values. Those visions remain unrealized, but they remain possible. The choice between individual advancement through participation in oppressive systems and collective liberation through organized resistance is still available to us. The question is whether we have the courage and the solidarity to make the same choice that people like Maria Benedetto, Jacob Kowalski, Tommy Sullivan, and Katerina Nowak made in those desperate years of the 1890s. Their tears were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a struggle that continues today in different forms, but with the same fundamental stakes. Whether human beings will be treated as disposable resources to be exploited for profit, or as human beings deserving of dignity, security, and the genuine opportunity to develop their full potential in communities based on mutual aid rather than mutual exploitation. The story I'm about to tell you will make you understand why Maria Benedetto never spoke about her fourth year in America, not even to her own children, decades later. Because 1897 brought something to the tenement districts that was worse than disease, worse than starvation, worse even than the systematic exploitation that had already claimed so many lives. It brought the complete collapse of the mythology that had kept people like Maria clinging to hope. The economic panic that swept through the country that year wasn't just another downturn in the business cycle. It was the moment when the industrial machine that had been consuming human lives for profit finally began consuming itself. Factories closed overnight, construction projects were abandoned mid-build, and the entire network of exploitation that had sustained the tenement economy simply vanished, leaving hundreds of thousands of people with nothing but the survival skills they had learned in those overcrowded rooms. But here's what makes this story different from every other account of economic hardship you've ever heard. The people who suffered the most during the Panic of 1897 weren't passive victims waiting for rescue from above. They were seasoned organizers, hardened survivors, and experienced fighters who had spent years learning how to challenge the very system that was now collapsing around them. Maria Benedetto was no longer the naive 19-year-old who had stepped off the boat believing in American promises. She was 25 years old, scarred by 4 years of tenement life, and she possessed knowledge about how power actually worked in America that most college-educated citizens never acquired. When the garment factory where she worked closed its doors for the final time, Maria didn't go home to cry. She went home to organize. The basement meetings that had started as informal conversations between neighbors had evolved into something resembling a parallel government for the tenement districts. When the official economy collapsed, when landlords stopped collecting rent because tenants had no money to pay, when police stopped patrolling because the city couldn't afford their salaries, the organizing networks that people like Maria and Katerina had built became the only functioning institutions in their communities. These networks faced challenges that would have destroyed less experienced groups. How do you feed 10,000 people when there are no jobs and no money? How do you maintain order in overcrowded buildings when the official authorities have abandoned their responsibilities? How do you keep communities together when individual families are being torn apart by starvation and desperation? The answers they developed weren't found in any textbook or government manual. They were improvised solutions based on years of collective struggle and mutual aid. Buildings were managed cooperatively, with residents taking turns maintaining heating systems and organizing waste disposal. Food was distributed according to need, rather than ability to pay, with families contributing whatever they could to common kitchens that served entire blocks. Most remarkably, the networks established their own systems of justice and conflict resolution that were more effective than the courts that had routinely ignored tenement problems. When disputes arose between families, when domestic violence threatened women and children, when theft or fraud disrupted community resources, neighborhood assemblies would convene to hear evidence and determine appropriate responses. These assemblies operated on principles that were radically different from the legal system that served wealthy New Yorkers. Instead of punishment and retribution, they focused on restitution and rehabilitation. Instead of excluding people from the community, they looked for ways to address the underlying conditions that led to harmful behavior. Tommy Sullivan, now 17 years old and hardened by 6 years of street survival, became one of the key organizers of these alternative justice systems. His understanding of criminal behavior, gained through his own participation in the underground economy, made him effective at distinguishing between people who were acting out of desperation and people who were genuinely predatory. Tommy had watched the tenement districts produce both kinds of people in large numbers, and he understood that the difference wasn't inherent character, but circumstance and choice. People who had been pushed beyond their limits by systematic oppression sometimes made decisions that harmed their neighbors, but that didn't make them irredeemable. People who had learned to profit from others' desperation, on the other hand, represented a genuine threat to community survival. The neighborhood assemblies that Tommy helped organize developed sophisticated methods for making these distinctions and responding appropriately to different kinds of harmful behavior. A mother who stole food to feed her starving children would be connected with community resources and support systems. A loan shark who charged desperate families impossible interest rates would be confronted collectively and forced to change his practices or leave the community entirely. These systems of community justice were imperfect and sometimes made mistakes, but they were responsive to community needs in ways that official legal institutions never had been. More importantly, they were based on the understanding that individual behavior was shaped by social conditions, and that changing those conditions was more effective than punishing people for responding to them. Katerina Nowak, now 21 and one of the most experienced organizers in the district, began developing what she called schools of resistance that taught practical skills for surviving economic collapse while maintaining community solidarity. These schools met in abandoned buildings, closed factories, and tenement basements, using spaces that the official economy had discarded. The curriculum of these schools was unlike anything that existed in official educational institutions. Students learned how to organize cooperative businesses that could provide income without exploiting workers. They studied the psychology of oppression and resistance, understanding how systems of domination worked and how they could be challenged. They practiced collective decision-making processes that allowed large groups of people to reach consensus without relying on traditional authority structures. But the schools also taught practical skills that were immediately relevant to survival during economic collapse. Students learned how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to treat common diseases without access to doctors, how to maintain heating and plumbing systems when landlords abandoned their buildings, how to mediate conflicts without relying on police or courts. Most importantly, the schools taught people how to maintain hope and solidarity during periods of extreme hardship. Katerina had observed that economic desperation could either bring communities together or tear them apart, depending on whether people understood their individual suffering as part of a collective struggle or as evidence of personal failure. The schools of resistance were designed to help people understand the systematic nature of their oppression, while also developing practical skills for collective survival. They created environments where people could process their individual trauma, while also contributing to collective healing and resistance. Maria Benedetto began teaching at one of these schools, sharing her knowledge of garment production with women who were trying to establish cooperative sewing operations. But Maria's most valuable contribution wasn't her technical skills. It was her ability to help other women understand how their individual experiences connected to broader patterns of exploitation and resistance. Maria had learned to see her own story not as a series of personal failures and successes, but as one thread in a larger tapestry of systematic oppression and collective struggle. This perspective allowed her to help other women understand that their suffering wasn't evidence of personal inadequacy, but evidence of a system that was designed to extract maximum value from their labor while providing minimum compensation and protection. This shift in understanding was psychologically transformative for women who had spent years blaming themselves for conditions that were entirely beyond their individual control. Instead of competing with each other for scarce resources and opportunities, they began collaborating to create alternatives to the systems that had been exploiting them. The cooperative sewing operation that Maria helped establish became a model for other collective businesses throughout the tenement districts. Instead of working for factory owners who extracted profits from their labor, the women worked for themselves, sharing both the work and the profits according to principles they developed collectively. The cooperative faced enormous challenges that private businesses didn't have to navigate. They had to develop systems for making decisions democratically, which was slower and more complicated than having a single owner make all the choices. They had to find ways to balance individual needs with collective responsibilities, which required ongoing negotiation and compromise. They had to compete in markets that were designed to favor businesses that could exploit workers and cut costs in ways that the cooperative refused to do. But the cooperative also had advantages that private businesses couldn't match. The women who worked there were motivated by more than just individual survival. They were motivated by the success of an enterprise that belonged to all of them. They were willing to work longer hours and accept lower immediate compensation because they understood that they were building something that would benefit their entire community over time. Most importantly, the cooperative created working conditions that supported human dignity rather than destroying it. The women established reasonable hours that allowed time for rest and family responsibilities. They created safe working environments that prioritized health over speed of production. They developed systems for sharing knowledge and skills so that everyone could learn and advance, rather than being trapped in repetitive, mind-numbing tasks. The success of the cooperative sewing operation inspired similar experiments throughout the tenement districts. Construction workers like Jacob Kowalski began organizing cooperative building projects that employed community members to improve their own living conditions, rather than enriching distant landlords. Street vendors established cooperative purchasing networks that allowed them to buy merchandise at lower costs and share the benefits of bulk buying. Children and teenagers developed their own cooperative enterprises that provided income while also serving community needs. They established cooperative childcare services that allowed more adults to participate in productive work. They organized cooperative food distribution systems that ensured no one in their communities went hungry, even when there was no money to buy food through official channels. These cooperative enterprises weren't just economic experiments. They were political statements about what kind of society was possible when people organized their relationships around mutual aid rather than mutual exploitation. They demonstrated that alternatives to predatory capitalism weren't just theoretical possibilities, but practical realities that could be created by ordinary people working together. The networks of cooperative enterprises that developed during the economic collapse of 1897 created a parallel economy that operated according to completely different principles than the official market system. Instead of competition, they emphasized cooperation. Instead of individual accumulation, they emphasized collective benefit. Instead of treating labor as a commodity to be purchased at the lowest possible price, they treated work as a contribution to community well-being that deserved fair compensation and respectful conditions. This parallel economy wasn't large enough to replace the official system, but it was large enough to demonstrate that different economic relationships were possible. More importantly, it provided material support for thousands of families during a period when the official economy had completely abandoned them. But the most significant achievement of the parallel economy wasn't economic. It was cultural. It created spaces where people could experience relationships based on solidarity rather than exploitation, where they could participate in decision-making processes that affected their daily lives, where they could contribute their skills and knowledge to collective projects that served community needs. These experiences were transformative for people who had spent years being treated as disposable resources by employers, landlords, and institutions that were supposed to serve them. Instead of being passive recipients of decisions made by others, they became active participants in shaping their own communities and their own futures. Jacob Kowalski discovered talents and abilities he never knew he possessed when he began participating in cooperative building projects. After years of working for construction bosses who treated him as nothing more than a strong back and a pair of hands, Jacob found himself contributing ideas about design and planning, teaching skills to younger workers, and helping to make decisions about how projects should be organized and executed. The cooperative projects allowed Jacob to use his full intelligence and creativity in ways that wage labor never had. Instead of following orders and performing repetitive tasks, he was solving problems, developing new techniques, and collaborating with others to create buildings that served community needs rather than maximizing profits for distant owners. But perhaps most importantly, the cooperative projects gave Jacob a sense of purpose and dignity that had been systematically stripped away by years of exploitative employment. He was no longer just trying to earn enough money to survive another day. He was contributing to the creation of better living conditions for his entire community. This restoration of purpose and dignity was happening to thousands of people throughout the tenement districts as they participated in cooperative enterprises and community organizing projects. People who had been convinced that they were worthless, that they had nothing valuable to contribute to society, discovered that they possessed knowledge, skills, and wisdom that were essential for community survival and development. The schools of resistance that Katerina had established began documenting these discoveries, collecting stories and testimonies from people whose talents had been revealed through cooperative work and community organizing. These stories became powerful tools for convincing other community members that they too possessed valuable capabilities that had been suppressed by systems of exploitation. Katerina understood that one of the most insidious aspects of systematic oppression was the way it convinced people that their suffering was evidence of personal inadequacy rather than systematic injustice. People who had been ground down by years of exploitation often internalized the messages they had received about their own worthlessness, making them less likely to participate in collective efforts to change their conditions. The schools of resistance were designed to counter this internalized oppression by creating environments where people could rediscover their own capabilities and understand their individual experiences as part of broader patterns of systematic abuse. They provided spaces where people could process their trauma while also developing skills for resistance and community building. But the schools also served another crucial function. They preserved and transmitted the knowledge that communities had developed through years of struggle and experimentation, the techniques for cooperative organization, the methods for collective decision-making, the strategies for resistance and survival. All of this knowledge was at risk of being lost if it wasn't systematically recorded and shared. Katerina began working with other organizers to create what they called libraries of resistance that collected and preserved the wisdom that their communities had developed. These libraries contained practical manuals for organizing cooperatives, historical accounts of successful resistance campaigns, theoretical analyses of how oppression worked and how it could be challenged, and personal testimonies from people who had participated in collective struggles. The libraries of resistance weren't just repositories of information. They were active centers for political education and community organizing. People would come to the libraries to research solutions to problems their communities were facing, to learn from the experiences of other groups who had faced similar challenges, and to contribute their own knowledge and experience to the collective store of wisdom. Maria Benedetto became one of the key contributors to these libraries, documenting her own journey from naive immigrant to experienced organizer and analyzing the lessons she had learned through years of individual struggle and collective action. Her writings helped other women understand how to navigate the psychological challenges of organizing work, how to build trust across ethnic and linguistic barriers, and how to maintain hope during periods of extreme hardship. But Maria's most important contribution to the libraries of resistance was her analysis of how the mythology of individual success had been used to prevent collective action and maintain systems of exploitation. She wrote detailed accounts of how she had been recruited into participating in her own oppression, how she had internalized messages about her own inadequacy, and how she had learned to understand her individual suffering as part of a systematic pattern that could be challenged collectively. These psychological insights were crucial for helping other people understand how oppression worked at the level of individual consciousness, and how it could be resisted through collective action and mutual support. Maria's writings helped people understand that their individual feelings of shame, inadequacy, and despair weren't personal failings, but responses to systematic abuse that were shared by thousands of others who had been subjected to similar conditions. The libraries of resistance became centers for developing what organizers called collective consciousness, the understanding that individual suffering was connected to systematic oppression and that individual liberation required collective action. This consciousness wasn't just an intellectual understanding, it was an emotional and spiritual transformation that allowed people to see themselves as part of a larger community of resistance, rather than as isolated individuals struggling alone against impossible odds. Tommy Sullivan contributed to the libraries by documenting the underground economy that had developed in the tenement districts, analyzing how criminal activity and informal enterprise were responses to the failures of the official economic system. His writings helped people understand that much of what was labeled as deviant or criminal behavior was actually creative adaptation to impossible circumstances. Tommy's analysis was important because it challenged the moral frameworks that were used to justify the criminalization and punishment of poor people. Instead of treating crime as evidence of individual moral failure, he demonstrated how criminal behavior was produced by systematic conditions that left people with few alternatives for survival. This understanding was crucial for developing effective responses to harmful behavior within the tenement communities. Instead of simply punishing people who stole, cheated, or engaged in violence, the community organizing networks could address the underlying conditions that led to such behavior while also protecting community members from harm. Tommy's work also documented the positive aspects of the underground economy, showing how informal networks of mutual aid, resource sharing, and collective survival had developed in response to the failures of official institutions. These networks weren't just survival mechanisms, they were models for alternative economic relationships that could serve as foundations for larger-scale cooperative enterprises. The documentation work that was happening in the libraries of resistance served multiple purposes beyond preserving knowledge for future generations. It helped current organizers understand their own experiences more clearly by placing individual struggles in broader historical and social contexts. It provided tools for analyzing current conditions and developing effective strategies for resistance and community building. Most importantly, the documentation work helped create a sense of historical continuity that connected current struggles to past resistance movements and future possibilities for social transformation. People who were living through extremely difficult conditions could understand themselves as part of a long tradition of resistance that had achieved significant victories despite facing overwhelming odds. This sense of historical continuity was psychologically crucial for maintaining hope during periods when immediate victories seemed impossible. People could understand that their current struggles were part of a larger historical process of social change that might take generations to complete, but was nonetheless moving in the direction of greater justice and human dignity. The economic collapse of 1897 created conditions that were devastating for individual families, but transformative for collective organizing. The complete failure of official institutions forced communities to develop their own alternatives, and the parallel economy that emerged during this period demonstrated possibilities for social organization that had never been tested on such a large scale. By 1898, the tenement districts had become laboratories for alternative social and economic relationships that challenged every assumption about how modern industrial societies had to be organized. The cooperative enterprises, community justice systems, schools of resistance, and libraries of resistance had created a comprehensive alternative to the systems of exploitation that had dominated American society during the Gilded Age. But these experiments in cooperative living were taking place in the context of a broader society that remained committed to predatory capitalism and systematic exploitation. The wealthy classes who had profited from tenement misery hadn't disappeared. They had simply retreated to their uptown mansions to wait for economic conditions to improve so they could resume their extraction of profit from human suffering. The question that faced the tenement organizing networks in 1898 was whether their alternative institutions could survive the inevitable attempts by the wealthy and powerful to reassert their control over the city's economic and political systems. The cooperatives, the community assemblies, the schools and libraries, all of these experiments in democratic self-governance were about to face their greatest test. Because something was stirring in the marble halls of City Hall and the panelled boardrooms of Wall Street. The men who owned the tenements, the factories, and the banks were beginning to understand that the economic collapse hadn't just created temporary hardship for the poor. It had created space for the development of alternative systems that threatened their entire model of wealth extraction and social control. The parallel economy that had emerged in the tenement districts wasn't just providing survival resources for desperate people. It was demonstrating that ordinary working people could organize complex economic and social institutions without bosses, without landlords, without the entire apparatus of exploitation that had made a few men incredibly wealthy while keeping millions in poverty. This demonstration of alternative possibilities was more dangerous to the established order than any riot or strike had ever been. Riots could be suppressed with police violence. Strikes could be broken with scab labor and economic pressure. But cooperative enterprises that actually worked, that actually improved people's lives while treating them with dignity, these represented a fundamental challenge to the ideological foundations of American capitalism. The wealthy classes understood that if working people could see that alternatives to exploitation were possible, if they could experience relationships based on cooperation rather than domination, if they could participate in economic enterprises that served community needs rather than private profit, then the entire system of systematic oppression that had made the Gilded Age possible would be threatened. So in 1898, as economic conditions began to stabilize and official institutions began to reassert their authority, the tenement organizing networks found themselves facing a coordinated campaign of repression that was more sophisticated and more vicious than anything they had experienced during the strikes and protests of previous years. The campaign began with new laws that made cooperative enterprises illegal unless they were licensed and regulated by city agencies that were controlled by the same men who owned the tenements and factories. These laws were presented as consumer protection measures designed to ensure that cooperative businesses met appropriate standards for safety and quality, but the licensing requirements were designed to be impossible for genuine cooperative enterprises to meet. They required capital investments that cooperatives couldn't afford, management structures that violated cooperative principles, and operating procedures that would have eliminated the democratic decision-making processes that were central to cooperative organization. The cooperative sewing operation that Maria had helped establish was one of the first targets of this legal assault. City inspectors arrived with demands for extensive documentation of business practices, safety modifications that would have cost more than the cooperative's entire annual income, and licensing fees that were clearly designed to force the enterprise to close. Maria and her co-workers faced a choice that was becoming familiar to organizers throughout the tenement districts. They could comply with the new regulations, which would have transformed their cooperative into a traditional exploitative business, or they could continue operating illegally and face arrest and imprisonment. The choice was made more difficult by the fact that the women working in the cooperative had families who depended on the income from their work. Closing the cooperative wouldn't just mean the end of a political experiment. It would mean a return to the desperate search for exploitative employment that had characterized their lives before cooperative alternatives became available. But the women also understood that compliance with the new regulations would mean the end of everything they had built together. The democratic decision-making processes, the fair distribution of profits, the respectful working conditions, the sense of dignity and purpose that came from working for themselves rather than for exploitative employers. All of this would be lost if they accepted the legal framework that was being imposed on them. The decision they made was characteristic of the moral courage that had been developed through years of collective struggle. They chose to continue operating illegally, accepting the risk of arrest and punishment in order to preserve the cooperative principles that had transformed their working lives. This decision was being made by cooperative enterprises throughout the tenement districts, and it created a situation where thousands of people were deliberately choosing to violate laws that they understood to be unjust. The civil disobedience that resulted wasn't the spontaneous uprising of desperate people. It was the calculated resistance of experienced organizers who understood exactly what they were risking and why it was necessary. The mass arrests that followed were intended to break the spirit of the organizing networks by demonstrating that the state would use violence to maintain systems of exploitation. Hundreds of people were imprisoned under conditions that were designed to be punitive rather than rehabilitative, separated from their families and communities for months or years. But the arrests also had an unintended consequence. They brought together organizers from different communities and different struggles under the same roof, creating opportunities for sharing knowledge and developing coordinated strategies that might not have developed otherwise. The city jail became another organizing space, where people like Maria, Katerina, Tommy, and Jacob found themselves in daily contact with organizers from other industries, other neighborhoods, and other ethnic communities. The conversations that took place in the overcrowded cells were as important as the basement meetings and neighborhood assemblies that had been taking place in the tenement districts. These conversations revealed that the repression being directed against the tenement organizing networks was part of a much broader campaign to reassert elite control over American society after the economic disruptions of 1897. Similar attacks on cooperative enterprises and community organizing were taking place in industrial cities throughout the country, suggesting that a coordinated strategy was being implemented by wealthy interests who understood the threat that democratic alternatives posed to their power. But the conversations also revealed that resistance to this repression was developing in all of these cities, and that the knowledge and experience that had been developed in the tenement districts could be valuable for organizers who were facing similar challenges in other contexts. When Maria was finally released from jail after serving 6 months for operating an unlicensed cooperative enterprise, she returned to a tenement district that had been transformed once again. The most visible cooperative enterprises had been closed or driven underground, but the networks of mutual aid and collective support that had sustained them were still functioning. More importantly, the experience of coordinated repression had clarified for everyone involved that their local struggles were part of a national and international conflict between democratic cooperation and exploitative domination. The choice wasn't just between different ways of organizing economic enterprises, it was between fundamentally different visions of what human society could become. This understanding marked the beginning of a new phase in the development of resistance movements that would eventually contribute to major changes in American society during the 20th century. The people who had learned to organize cooperative enterprises in the tenement districts would become leaders of labor unions, socialist parties, and civil rights organizations that would force American capitalism to accommodate at least some demands for economic democracy and social justice. But that's a story for another time. What matters for understanding the tenement experience is that the tears shed in those overcrowded rooms weren't just expressions of individual suffering. They were also expressions of collective grief for a society that had chosen exploitation over cooperation, private profit over community well-being, and systematic oppression over democratic participation. The immigrants who lived and died in the tenement buildings of the Gilded Age left behind more than just stories of victimization and exploitation. They left behind examples of how ordinary people could organize alternative institutions based on mutual aid, democratic decision-making, and respect for human dignity. They demonstrated that cooperation was not only possible, but more effective than competition for meeting human needs and solving social problems. The lessons they learned through years of struggle remain relevant because the fundamental conflict they were engaged in remains unresolved. The choice between organizing society around private profit or community well-being, between treating people as disposable resources or as human beings deserving of dignity and respect, between accepting systematic oppression as inevitable or working collectively to create democratic alternatives, these choices continue to confront us today. The tenement organizers didn't solve all the problems they were fighting against, but they demonstrated that those problems weren't inevitable consequences of industrial development or human nature. They were consequences of specific choices made by people with power, and they could be changed by different choices made by people working together for different goals. Their tears were not shed in vain if we learn from their struggles and continue their work of building communities based on cooperation rather than exploitation, democracy rather than domination, and human dignity rather than private profit. The alternatives they created, in the basement meetings and cooperative enterprises of the 1890s remain possible today, if we have the courage and solidarity to choose cooperation over competition, community over individualism, and collective liberation over individual advancement within systems of oppression. The story of the tenement districts during the Gilded Age is ultimately a story about human potential, the potential for cruelty and exploitation that was demonstrated by the wealthy classes who created and profited from systematic oppression, but also the potential for courage, creativity, and solidarity that was demonstrated by the working people who organized alternatives to that oppression. Both potentials remain available to us today. The question is which one we will choose to develop and which one we will choose to resist. The immigrants who crowded into those disease-ridden buildings carrying dreams that were slowly crushed by poverty and exploitation have left us with both a warning about what happens when societies choose cruelty over compassion, and an example of how ordinary people can work together to create something better than what they inherited. Their legacy lives on in every cooperative enterprise, every community organization, every act of mutual aid, and every collective effort to create democratic of mutual aid that chooses human dignity over private profit. But their legacy also lives on in the ongoing systems of exploitation that continue to extract wealth from human suffering, in the mythologies that convince people their oppression is their own fault, and in the isolation that prevents collective action against systematic injustice. The tenement buildings themselves began to change after 1900, as progressive era reforms forced landlords to make basic improvements to sanitation and safety. New laws required windows in every room, fireproof stairwells, and adequate bathroom facilities. These reforms were victories that had been won through decades of organizing, strikes, and political pressure by the very people who had been living in those conditions. But the reforms also revealed something troubling about how American society addressed systematic injustice. Instead of questioning why people like Thomas Burns had been allowed to profit from human misery for so many years, instead of examining the economic system that made tenement exploitation profitable, the reforms focused on technical improvements that made exploitation slightly more humane while leaving its fundamental structure intact. Maria Benedetto, now in her 30s and a veteran of countless organizing campaigns, watched these reforms with mixed feelings. The improved conditions would prevent some of the diseases that had killed so many of her neighbors, would reduce some of the daily suffering that had characterized tenement life for decades. These were real improvements that would make real differences in people's lives. But Maria also understood that the reforms were designed to preserve the essential features of the tenement system while eliminating only its most obviously barbaric aspects. Landlords would still extract maximum profit from minimal investment. Workers would still be paid wages that barely covered survival. Families would still be crowded into spaces that were too small for human dignity. The mythology of individual opportunity would remain intact. The systematic nature of economic exploitation would remain hidden, and the cooperative alternatives that had emerged during the economic collapse would remain illegal or marginalized. The reforms addressed symptoms while preserving the disease. This pattern would characterize American responses to systematic injustice throughout the 20th century. Technical improvements that made oppression more tolerable without eliminating the systems that created oppression in the first place. Better working conditions that didn't challenge the fundamental relationship between employers and workers. Improved housing that didn't question the profit motive in providing shelter. Expanded educational opportunities that didn't address the economic inequalities that made education irrelevant for many students. Jacob Kowalski lived long enough to see his grandchildren attend public schools with better buildings and more resources than had been available to his own children. He was proud of their educational achievements and grateful for the opportunities that previous generations had fought to create. But he also observed that these educational opportunities were still distributed unequally, still shaped by economic class and ethnic background, still designed to prepare most students for lives of subordination rather than democratic participation. The construction industry, where Jacob had worked for decades, gradually developed safety regulations that reduced the number of workers who died or were permanently injured on job sites. These regulations were victories that had been won through years of organizing by workers who understood that their employers would never voluntarily prioritize human life over profit margins. But the basic structure of the construction industry remained unchanged. Workers still had no control over the projects they built, still received wages that represented only a fraction of the value they created, still faced unemployment during economic downturns while the owners of construction companies maintained their wealth regardless of economic conditions. Jacob began teaching his grandchildren the skills he had learned through decades of organizing experience, not because he expected them to face identical conditions, but because he understood that the fundamental conflicts he had fought would continue in different forms. The choice between individual survival and collective liberation, between accepting exploitation and organizing resistance, between competing with fellow workers and building solidarity across ethnic and industrial lines, these choices would confront each generation in new contexts. Tommy Sullivan became a labor organizer whose career spanned the early decades of the 20th century, helping to build unions in industries throughout the Northeast. His understanding of how wealthy Americans thought about working people, gained through years of conducting slum tours, made him particularly effective at countering the ideological justifications for exploitation that employers used to maintain their authority. But Tommy also discovered that the labor movement itself was shaped by many of the same limitations that had characterized the reform efforts of the progressive era. Union leaders often focused on improving wages and working conditions for their members while accepting the basic structure of employer-worker relationships that made exploitation possible in the first place. Many unions excluded women, immigrants, and racial minorities from membership, reproducing the same divisions that employers had used to prevent solidarity among workers. The cooperative alternatives that had emerged in the tenement districts, the democratic decision-making processes that had characterized community organizing, the vision of economic relationships based on mutual aid rather than competition. These were largely abandoned in favor of more limited goals that didn't challenge the fundamental structure of American capitalism. Tommy spent his career trying to bridge the gap between the radical vision of cooperative democracy that had emerged during the tenement organizing of the 1890s and the more limited goals of mainstream labor unions. He had varying degrees of success in different contexts, but he never lost sight of the broader transformation that would be necessary to eliminate systematic exploitation rather than just making it more tolerable. Katarina Nowak continued her work in political education throughout her life, adapting the schools of resistance that had developed in the tenement districts to address the changing conditions that working people faced in different periods. Her understanding of how oppression worked at the psychological level, how it convinced people to participate in their own exploitation, remained relevant as new forms of systematic abuse emerged. During the 1920s, Katerina observed how consumer culture was being used to create new forms of social control that were more sophisticated than the crude exploitation of the tenement era. Instead of simply forcing people to work under terrible conditions for survival wages, the new system encouraged people to work under slightly better conditions for wages that allowed them to purchase consumer goods, that provided temporary satisfaction while keeping them trapped in cycles of debt and dependence. The installment buying that allowed working families to purchase automobiles, household appliances, and other consumer goods created the illusion of prosperity while actually increasing their economic vulnerability. Families who missed payments could lose not just their recent purchases, but their homes and their savings, creating new forms of economic insecurity that served the same function as the direct exploitation of the tenement era. Katerina developed educational programs that helped working people understand how consumer debt functioned as a form of social control, how advertising manipulated their desires and aspirations, how the mythology of individual success through consumption distracted from the collective action that would be necessary to address systematic economic inequality. But Katerina also observed positive developments that built on the organizing traditions that had emerged in the tenement districts. The cooperative movement continued to develop throughout the early 20th century, creating credit unions, housing cooperatives, and consumer cooperatives that demonstrated alternatives to exploitative business practices. The settlement house movement, community organizing efforts in immigrant neighborhoods, and adult education programs all drew on methods and insights that had been developed through the tenement organizing experience. Political movements for women's suffrage, civil rights, and economic justice used organizing strategies that had been tested and refined during the struggles of the 1890s. Most importantly, the understanding that individual suffering was connected to systematic oppression, that collective action was necessary for meaningful change, that ordinary people possessed the knowledge and capability necessary for democratic self-governance. These insights continue to inspire new generations of organizers who face different but related challenges. The children and grandchildren of the tenement organizers carried these lessons into their participation in the labor movements of the 1930s, the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s, the anti-war movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and the environmental justice movements that continue today. Each of these movements faced the same basic choice that had confronted the tenement organizers: whether to focus on reforms that would make systematic oppression more tolerable, or to work for fundamental changes that would eliminate the systems that created oppression in the first place. The tension between these two approaches continues to shape progressive politics today. The reformist approach achieves concrete improvements in people's daily lives and builds political coalitions that can win electoral victories, but it also tends to preserve the fundamental structures that create inequality and injustice. The radical approach challenges those fundamental structures and maintains a vision of comprehensive social transformation, but it often struggles to achieve immediate improvements that would make people's lives better in the short term and build the broad support necessary for long-term change. The tenement organizers of the 1890s faced this same tension, and their experience suggests that both approaches are necessary, but neither is sufficient by itself. The cooperative enterprises and community organizing networks they built provided immediate relief from exploitation, while also demonstrating alternatives to the systems that created exploitation. Their most significant achievement was creating spaces where people could experience relationships based on cooperation rather than domination, where they could participate in democratic decision-making about issues that affected their daily lives, where they could contribute their knowledge and abilities to collective projects that served community needs. These experiences were transformative for people who had been treated as disposable resources by employers, landlords, and institutions that were supposed to serve them. They provided proof that alternatives to systematic oppression weren't just theoretical possibilities, but practical realities that could be created by ordinary people working together. The proof of concept that emerged from the tenement organizing experience continues to inspire people who are working for social change today. The community land trusts that provide affordable housing while removing land from speculation, the worker cooperatives that demonstrate alternatives to exploitative employment, the participatory budgeting processes that allow communities to make decisions about public spending. All of these contemporary experiments draw on lessons learned in the overcrowded rooms and narrow hallways of tenement buildings over a century ago. But the tenement experience also provides warnings about the obstacles that face efforts to create systematic change. The coordinated repression that destroyed many of the cooperative enterprises of the 1890s demonstrates that powerful interests will use violence and legal manipulation to preserve systems that serve their advantage. The reforms that followed the tenement organizing show how systematic problems can be addressed through technical improvements that preserve fundamental structures of exploitation while eliminating only their most obviously barbaric features. The psychological warfare that convinced many immigrants to participate in their own oppression illustrates how ideological manipulation can be more effective than direct coercion for maintaining social control. These warnings remain relevant because the fundamental conflicts that characterize the tenement era persist in different forms today. The choice between organizing society around private profit or community well-being, between treating people as disposable resources or as human beings deserving of dignity and respect, between accepting systematic oppression as inevitable or working collectively to create democratic alternatives, these choices continue to confront every generation. The immigrants who crowded into those disease-ridden tenement buildings during the Gilded Age were not passive victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were active participants in creating the conditions that shaped their communities and their own lives. Their individual choices about whether to compete or cooperate, whether to accept exploitation or organize resistance, whether to maintain isolation or build solidarity, these choices collectively determined whether their communities would be characterized by desperation or hope. Their tears were not just expressions of individual suffering, but also expressions of collective grief for dreams deferred and opportunities denied by systems that prioritize private wealth over human well-being. But their organizing was not just a response to immediate hardship. It was an expression of collective imagination about what human society could become if organized around different principles. The cooperative enterprises they built, the community assemblies they organized, the schools of resistance they established, the libraries of knowledge they created, all of these institutions demonstrated that democracy was not just a political system, but a way of organizing all aspects of social life. Their vision of comprehensive democracy, where people could participate meaningfully in making decisions about their housing, their work, their children's education, their community's development, remains largely unrealized. But their experience proved that such democracy was not just a utopian dream, but a practical possibility that could be achieved through organized effort and collective commitment. The tenement buildings where they lived have mostly been torn down or renovated beyond recognition. The specific economic conditions that created the extreme exploitation of the Gilded Age have been modified by decades of reform and regulation. The ethnic communities that provided the foundation for their organizing have been dispersed by suburban development and economic mobility, but the fundamental questions they grappled with remain unresolved. How do we create economic systems that serve human needs rather than private profit? How do we build communities that support human dignity rather than extracting value from human suffering? How do we organize democratic institutions that allow meaningful participation by ordinary people rather than domination by wealthy elites? These questions cannot be answered through individual effort or consumer choice. They require collective action by people who understand that their individual well-being is connected to the well-being of their communities and their society as a whole. The tenement organizers understood this connection not as an abstract principle, but as a concrete reality that shaped their daily lives. They knew that individual success within systems of exploitation was both impossible for most people and ultimately meaningless even for those who achieved it, because individual success that depended on others' exploitation was built on foundations that could collapse at any time. They chose instead to work for collective liberation through cooperative enterprise and democratic organizing, accepting the risks and sacrifices that such work required because they understood that no other choice offered genuine security or meaningful freedom. Their choice remains available to us today. We can continue trying to achieve individual success within systems that create widespread suffering and environmental destruction, accepting the mythology that such systems are inevitable and that our individual consumption choices are the extent of our political agency. Or we can follow their example by building cooperative enterprises, community organizations, and political movements that challenge the fundamental structures of exploitation and create alternatives based on mutual aid, democratic participation, and ecological sustainability. The tears that fell in those overcrowded tenement rooms were not shed in vain if we learn from their struggles and continue their work of building a society worthy of human dignity and potential. Their legacy is not just the story of what they endured, but the example of what they created in D. The reminder that ordinary people working together possess the power to transform even the most entrenched systems of oppression. The winter of 1899 brought something to the tenement districts that nobody had anticipated. It wasn't another economic collapse, or another wave of disease, or even another coordinated campaign of repression. It was something far more subtle and potentially more dangerous: the systematic co-optation of the organizing networks that had emerged during the previous decade of struggle. The process began when a group of wealthy philanthropists, led by a steel magnate named Harrison Whitmore, announced the formation of the Tenement Improvement Society. Whitmore had made his fortune using the same exploitative labor practices that had driven workers to organize in the first place, but he now presented himself as a concerned citizen who wanted to help solve the housing crisis that had created so much suffering in Lower Manhattan. The Tenement Improvement Society offered to fund improved housing for immigrant families, but only for those who demonstrated what they called moral fitness and commitment to American values. Families who wanted to qualify for the improved housing had to sign agreements promising not to participate in labor organizing, not to join cooperative enterprises, and not to engage in any activities that the society deemed incompatible with good citizenship. The offer was seductive because it provided something that the organizing networks had never been able to deliver: immediate, tangible improvement in living conditions, without the risks and sacrifices that collective action required. Families could escape the overcrowded, disease-ridden tenements by simply agreeing to abandon the solidarity and resistance that had sustained their communities through the worst periods of exploitation. Maria Benedetto faced this choice when representatives of the Tenement Improvement Society visited her building and offered her family a chance to move into one of their new housing developments. The offer included not just better living conditions, but also guaranteed employment at wages that were higher than anything Maria had ever earned through cooperative work or factory labor. The catch was that accepting the offer meant signing an agreement that would prohibit her from participating in any of the organizing activities that had become central to her identity and her understanding of how social change happened. She would have to abandon the cooperative sewing enterprise she had helped build, stop teaching at the schools of resistance, and withdraw from the community networks that had sustained her through years of struggle. For Maria, now 33 years old and exhausted by a decade of fighting against impossible odds, the offer represented a genuine temptation. She could provide her family with security and comfort, escape from the daily grinding poverty that had characterized her entire American experience, and finally achieve some version of the individual success that had originally drawn her to America. But Maria also understood that accepting the offer meant participating in the destruction of everything she had helped build. The Tenement Improvement Society wasn't just trying to improve housing conditions. It was trying to eliminate the organizing networks that threatened the broader system of exploitation by offering individual rewards to people who abandoned collective resistance. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of using violence or legal repression to destroy the organizing networks, the wealthy philanthropists were using selective generosity to divide communities against themselves. People who accepted the improved housing would be removed from the tenement districts where organizing was taking place, while those who remained would be increasingly isolated and demoralized. Maria spent weeks agonizing over the decision, talking with other organizers about the implications of accepting or rejecting the society's offer. The conversations revealed that she wasn't the only one facing this choice. Similar offers were being made to key organizers throughout the tenement districts, creating a systematic campaign to decapitate the resistance movements by removing their most experienced leaders. Katerina Nowak was offered a position as a supervisor in one of the society's model factories, where she would earn more money in a month than she had ever seen in a year of cooperative work. The position would allow her to escape the economic insecurity that had characterized her entire adult life. But it would also require her to abandon her political education work and help manage a workforce according to the same exploitative principles she had spent years fighting against. Tommy Sullivan was offered a scholarship to attend a business college that would prepare him for a career in management, with the understanding that he would use his knowledge of tenement communities to help employers prevent future organizing efforts. The scholarship represented an educational opportunity that would have been unimaginable for someone of his background under normal circumstances. But it also required him to use his skills against the very communities that had shaped him. Jacob Kowalski was offered a position as a foreman on construction projects, funded by the Tenement Improvement Society, with wages that would allow him to move his family out of the tenements and into respectable working-class housing in Brooklyn. The position would give him authority and economic security that he had never experienced, but it would also require him to enforce the same unsafe working conditions and exploitative labor practices that had nearly killed him during his years as an ordinary construction worker. Each of these offers was carefully calibrated to appeal to the specific desires and vulnerabilities of the people who received them. The wealthy philanthropists had studied the organizing networks carefully, identifying the individuals whose departure would be most damaging to collective resistance efforts and crafting individual incentives that would be difficult to refuse. The offers also came at a moment when the organizing networks were particularly vulnerable. The economic recovery that had begun in 1898 had reduced some of the desperate conditions that had motivated people to participate in collective action, while the legal repression of cooperative enterprises had made it increasingly difficult to demonstrate that alternatives to individual advancement were viable. Many of the people who had participated enthusiastically in organizing during the worst periods of economic collapse were now questioning whether the risks and sacrifices of collective action were worth it when individual opportunities for improvement seemed to be available. The mythology of individual success that the organizing networks had worked so hard to counter was reasserting itself as economic conditions improved and selective opportunities became available to some community members. The decision that Maria ultimately made reflected the moral complexity of the situation she faced. She rejected the Tenement Improvement Society's offer for herself, but she encouraged her younger sister to accept a similar offer that would allow her to escape tenement conditions without having to sign the same restrictive agreements that were required of experienced organizers. Maria's decision was based on her understanding that someone needed to remain in the tenements to continue the organizing work, but also that people who had never participated in collective resistance shouldn't be expected to sacrifice individual opportunities for the sake of political principles they had never chosen to embrace. This distinction between different levels of political commitment and responsibility became crucial as the organizing networks tried to develop responses to the co-optation campaign. They couldn't demand that everyone make the same sacrifices, because that would have created resentment and division within communities that were already under enormous stress. But they also couldn't simply accept the systematic removal of their most experienced organizers, because that would have meant the end of collective resistance just at the moment when it was beginning to demonstrate genuine alternatives to individual advancement within exploitative systems.